The inbred Mountain Brothers' sick sexual habits, they kept their sister chained up in the basement of their farmhouse as their wife. The court records from 1883 show that this was the most disturbing case in Ozark County history. For years, two deformed brothers named Jebediah and Silas kept their sister Ara chained up in their remote farmhouse. They thought it was fair to get back at their father for making them ugly and miserable. But one day, during a thunderstorm, a traveling preacher came across their remote property. He heard something that scared him to death, a faint sound coming from under the floorboards, and a desperate plea scratched into a piece of cloth near the well. The brothers thought they were cleaning up their family's bloodline and that their sister owed them this sick payment for their cursed lives. When the truth finally came out, the whole community had to ask themselves a terrible question. How long had they chosen to ignore the darkness that was hiding in their own hills? The chain around Ara's ankle had cut into her skin so deeply that she couldn't feel the metal biting her anymore. The rhythmic clinking had become the metronome of her life in the dark, damp basement of the farmhouse, where the smell of mold and decay hung in the air. She had counted 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, each one by scratching marks into the wooden beam next to her bed. The exact number didn't matter as much now as the simple act of marking the passage of time, proof that she still had a piece of her old self. The basement door creaked open above her, and she heard footsteps she knew coming down the stairs that were falling apart. Jebediah was first. His spine was twisted, so he leaned to the left. His hunched shoulders made scary shadows in the flickering candlelight. Silas followed him up the narrow stairs, his huge body blocking the way. His misshapen face had the permanent scowl that had scared people in town since he was a child. They brought her dinner, a bowl of thin gruel, and a piece of stale bread that would barely fill a child's stomach, let alone a 22-year-old woman who had once run through the Ozark Hills like a wild animal. "Evening, sister," Jebediah said. His voice had that cold intelligence that had always made him the more dangerous of the two. He carefully placed the bowl next to her, as if this ritual somehow made their horrible situation more civilized. "You're looking peaked again. That won't do for the family's future." Silas grunted his agreement, but his dull eyes showed the same mix of shame and desperate need that always made Ara's skin crawl. "She has to be strong," he said, his words thick and awkward. "For the child, for making us whole again." Ara's hand instinctively went to her still flat stomach, where the life growing inside her was both her greatest fear and her most fragile hope. The brothers thought that having their sister have their child would somehow clean up their bloodline. They thought that their father's twisted desires and violent rages had put a curse on them, and that having their sister have their child would break that curse. They called it justice, as if her imprisonment and humiliation were payment for the sins that had made them ugly, hated, and pushed to the edges of civilized society. "Father made us monsters," Jebediah said, his pale eyes staring at something that wasn't there outside the basement walls. "His corruption runs in our blood. But you were always perfect, clean. The preacher in town used to say, 'You had the face of an angel before we had to bring you home.'" The word home twisted from his lips like a prayer corrupted into blasphemy. "This child will have your purity and our strength. It will be what we should have been." Ara had learned not to argue with their crazy ideas or point out the obvious flaws in their reasoning. She needed to save her strength for when it might really matter, so fighting back only caused her pain. Instead, she nodded and took the bowl with shaking hands, making herself eat the small amount of food while they watched with the satisfaction of farmers watching valuable livestock. The old farmhouse shook to its core as thunder rumbled overhead, and dust fell from the ceiling beams. The storm had been getting worse all afternoon, and now the Ozark sky opened up with the rage that came with the change from fall to winter in the mountains. The wind howled through the cracks in the foundation, bringing with it the smell of rain and freedom that felt so far away from her underground prison. A horse's whinny cut through the storm's roar above them, and then someone knocked on the front door. The brothers froze, and for a moment their eyes met in a panic that would have been funny if the situation weren't so dire. People didn't come to their remote farmhouse very often, and when they did, they were seen as threats that needed to be handled with care. "Be quiet," Jebediah hissed, even though he didn't need to. Ara had learned that making noise when strangers were around could cost her. "Not a sound, or you'll pay for it when they're gone." The pounding came again, this time more insistent, and a voice called out through the storm. "Hello! Please, I seek shelter from this tempest. I am a man of God, lost in these hills, a traveling preacher." Ara's heart raced as she heard the stranger's voice, which sounded just like hers. The brothers looked at each other again before Jebediah pointed to the stairs. They would have to answer. Refusing to let a preacher stay with them in such bad weather would raise suspicions and questions they couldn't afford. Ara pressed herself against the wall in the basement and listened to the muffled voices that came through the floorboards as their footsteps faded away and she heard the front door creak open above. The preacher's voice was kind and thankful, and it had the refined accent of someone who had been to school. When he talked about how God had led him to their door, she heard something she hadn't heard in a long time: real kindness, free of the corruption that had ruined every relationship she had had since she was a child. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of something that could have been hope in her chest. This man was a symbol of the world outside these walls, the society that her brothers were afraid of and stayed away from. If she could somehow get through to him and make him understand what was going on in this house of horrors, maybe the nightmare would finally end. But how? The chain kept her in place, and the brothers would be on the lookout for any signs of betrayal. But as she listened to the preacher talk about God's mercy and the light that shines in even the darkest places, Ara started to come up with a plan out of sheer desperation. She had one advantage that her captors had never thought of. They had no idea how far a woman with nothing to lose would go to get her freedom back. The storm kept going, but for the first time in 3 years, Ara started to think that dawn might really come. Reverend Thomas rode all night, and his conscience pushed him harder than the storm winds that blew through the mountain passes. The piece of cloth he had in his coat pocket felt like it was burning against his chest. It had a single word scratched into it with charcoal that haunted him every mile between the lonely farmhouse and the town of Redemption. The sun was rising over the eastern hills by the time he got to Sheriff Coleman's office. Long shadows were cast across the muddy streets where early merchants were setting up their goods. Sheriff Coleman had been dealing with the strange ways of mountain people for 20 years, and his weathered face showed little interest as the preacher told him about his scary experience. Coleman leaned back in his creaking chair, tobacco juice staining the corners of his mouth, and said, "Reverend, I appreciate your concern, but people in these hills have always done things their own way. The Whitmore boys, Jebediah and Silas, have been strange since they were kids because of their deformities. Their father was a hard man, cruel as winter, but that doesn't make them criminals." Thomas took the piece of cloth out of his pocket and carefully laid it on the sheriff's desk. The word help looked like it was jumping out of the fabric, desperate and damning. "This came from that house, Sheriff, from someone who managed to push it through a crack near their well. Someone who's being held against their will." The sheriff barely glanced at the evidence, waving a dismissive hand. "It could have come from anywhere. It could have been years ago. Hell, it could have come from their old mother. She was crazy and used to walk around talking to herself before she died. The Whitmores keep to themselves, pay their taxes when they can, and don't cause trouble in town. That's more than I can say for half the families up in those hollers." But Thomas was not a man easily deterred when his conscience was ignited. He spent the morning walking through Redemption's small business district, talking to shop owners and old-timers who remembered the Whitmore family from happier times. The picture that came out was disturbing. A father whose religious zeal had turned into something dark and violent. A mother who had become more and more alone and scared before her mysterious death. And 2 sons who had been made fun of and shunned because of their physical deformities until they just disappeared into the mountains. The most disturbing thing was that they kept talking about a beautiful, lively daughter who had gone missing from town almost 4 years ago with no explanation. Ara could feel the change in her brothers from the basement of the farmhouse, like a wild animal sensing the approach of a predator. They moved with a lot of energy, and their voices had sharp edges that weren't there before the preacher came. Jebediah walked back and forth in their small living space above, his uneven steps making a nervous rhythm that came through the floorboards. Silas, on the other hand, spent hours standing by the windows, watching the trees with suspicious eyes. This anger gave her the chance she needed. For the first time since she had been held captive, her brothers looked weak and unsure of how much power they had. When Jebediah brought her dinner, she looked up at him with what she hoped was a look of new understanding instead of planned manipulation. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound thoughtful instead of desperate, "about the child and the future of our family. Maybe you're right. Maybe this is how we fix what Father broke." Jebediah's pale eyes narrowed as he looked at her face for signs of lying. But Ara had learned to keep her face blank and obedient during her long months in prison. "You're starting to get it," he said slowly, though his voice still sounded tired. "This child will be our salvation, our chance to make something good out of the bad things we got from our parents." For the next few days, Ara acted like her life depended on it. She talked about their future family with what seemed like growing excitement, asked questions about their plans, and even thanked them for keeping them safe from the cruel world that had turned them all away. The act was so convincing that Silas let his guard down. Sometimes he would sit on the basement steps and talk about the child she was carrying in a way that made him feel awkward. But Ara's hands worked in secret while her brothers slept, even though she tried to make them think they were okay with her. She found out that one of the bricks in the wall behind her makeshift bed had been damaged by water getting in and the mortar crumbling with time. She worked night after night to loosen the brick, using a piece of rusted metal she had found in the basement's trash. The old house creaked and settled around her as she scraped away the mortar grain by grain. It was a simple but desperate plan. If she could take out enough bricks to make a hole, she might be able to get into the crawl space under the house and find a way to get away from there. It was a long shot, maybe even impossible, because she was weak and chained up, but it was a step toward freedom that she had been able to take. It was a night when the cold of autumn had settled deep into the valleys of the mountains. Ara had made a lot of progress on the brick by feeling it in the dark when she heard Jebediah's footsteps on the stairs at a strange hour. Before she could even put the loose brick back in place and get ready for bed, the basement was full of candlelight. "Smart girl," Jebediah said, his voice cold and funny, which made her blood run cold. "Did you think we wouldn't see the scratches on the wall and the mortar dust?" He held up the piece of metal she had been using, which he had found despite her best efforts to hide it. "Did you think we were stupid?" What happened next was quick and brutal. At his brother's call, Silas came down the stairs, and they both pulled Ara out of her corner, ignoring her cries and pleas. They cut her chain in half, which made it impossible for her to touch any of the walls. Then they sealed the loose brick with new mortar that Jebediah had brought from their barn. When they were done, Ara was in a circle of confinement so small that she could barely lie down. Her world was only a few square feet of damp earth and despair. "You will learn," Jebediah said as he put away their tools. "Resistance only brings suffering. We are your family now, your only reality. The sooner you accept that truth completely, the easier your life will become." In the darkness that followed their departure, Ara understood with crystal clarity that escape would not come through luck or simple cunning. She would need a strength she had never had before, a will to live that was stronger than their hate and longer lasting than their cruelty. She wouldn't win the war for her freedom by frantically grabbing at loose bricks. Instead, she would fight it in the shadows of her own mind, where they couldn't chain her thoughts or mortar shut her dreams of the world outside these walls. Reverend Thomas had become a man possessed, driven by a righteous anger that grew stronger with each passing day and each dead end he hit in his search for the truth. The sheriff's firing only made him more determined. Every morning, he walked through the worn streets of Redemption, looking for the oldest residents who might remember the Whitmore family before they disappeared into the mountain hollers. What he found was worse than anything he could have imagined. Samuel Briggs, who had lived in Redemption for 63 years and ran the general store, remembered when Ezekiel Whitmore and his pregnant wife first came to town in 1858. He was a preacher then, or at least he said he was, Briggs said, his eyes cloudy with memory. He had the fire of the Lord in him, but it was a cold fire, if you know what I mean. The kind that burns without giving warmth His wife was a gentle creature, pretty as a spring morning, but she grew thin and scared under his hand. When the first boy was born, twisted, Ezekiel took it as a sign of God's displeasure. When the second came out malformed as well, he declared the whole family cursed. Martha Henderson, the seamstress whose gnarled fingers still worked magic with needle and thread despite her 74 years, provided even more disturbing details. "Those poor boys," she said in a low voice, looking around her shop as if the walls might hear her. "Born with their spines bent and their faces marked by God's hand. But it wasn't their fault. Children can be cruel, and the town children drove them away from school, from church, from anywhere decent folk gathered. Ezekiel blamed his wife for bringing corruption into his bloodline, said her sins had poisoned his seed. But it was Dr. Cornelius Webb, now retired and spending his final years tending a small garden behind his modest house, who provided the missing piece that made Thomas's blood run cold. "I delivered that girl," Webb said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. 1,861 during a terrible winter storm. When Ezekiel saw her perfect face and unblemished limbs, something changed in him. He called her his redemption, his proof that God's favor could still shine on his house. But there was something unholy about the way he looked at that child that made my skin crawl. In the basement prison that had become her whole world, Ara was fighting her own war with weapons made out of need and sharpened by need. She could feel the baby moving inside her now that her pregnancy had progressed enough. It was a constant reminder of how she had been hurt and how she was responsible for something innocent that depended on her survival. The fact that she was pregnant made her maternal instincts stronger than her own need to stay alive, and with them came a cunning she had never known she had. She started to study her brothers with the same intensity as a general studying enemy positions, learning to read the small signs that showed how they were feeling, what they were afraid of, and where they were weak. Jebediah was very smart, but he was also very angry because he wanted to prove that he was better than the world that had turned him down. Silas, on the other hand, wanted to be accepted and validated like a child. Ara used these weaknesses to her advantage as she slowly started to drive them apart. "Jebediah thinks you're stupid," she whispered to Silas one night when he stayed in the basement longer than usual because she seemed to be following his orders. "He tells me so when you're not around. Says you're just like father was, all brawn and no brains, good for nothing but the heavy work." She lied with ease, and she saw Silas's hurt and anger flash across his misshapen face. She gave Jebediah a different kind of poison. During one of his evening visits, she said with fake innocence, "Your brother watches me when you're not home. He stands at the top of the stairs and stares at me with that hungry look in his eyes. Sometimes he touches himself while he watches. I thought you should know, since you're the one with the plans for our family's future." Within days, the seeds of disagreement she had planted began to grow. The brothers' talks got more tense, and they were more careful when they moved around each other. Silas started to question Jebediah's choices in small ways, and Jebediah's treatment of his younger brother became crueler than it had been before. Ara fed this growing rift with carefully chosen words and meaningful silences, all while pretending to be grateful for their sick vision of how to save their family. Thomas's search finally brought him to the most important witness of all, Widow Mary Finch, who lived in a run-down cabin on the edge of town. She was surrounded by wild herbs and roots that made her the unofficial midwife for mountain families who couldn't afford Dr. Webb's services or were too far away to get to him. The old woman was almost 80. Her mind was sometimes as sharp as the winter wind and sometimes clouded by age. But when Thomas talked about the Whitmore family, her eyes suddenly cleared and filled with a fear that had been building for decades. "I gave birth to all 3 of those kids," she said, her voice breaking like leaves in the fall. "The boys first, poor twisted things that broke their mother's heart. But that girl, that beautiful girl, she came into the world perfect, and I saw how her father looked at her. Even then, it wasn't right, the way he held her, the way he spoke about her being his redemption." The old woman's hands shook as she poured tea with leaves that smelled of mountain sage and bitter memory. Once, when the girl was about 12, their mother tried to leave. She packed what little she could carry and took the kids in the night. But Ezekiel found them before they got to the valley road. What he did to her that night. She stopped, shuddering with the weight of old secrets. She lasted 3 more years, but she was never the same, broken inside and out. When she finally died, it was almost a mercy. But the daughter, Thomas pressed, his heart hammering with the certainty that he was finally approaching the truth. What happened to Ara? Mary Finch's eyes filled with tears that had been waiting 20 years to fall. She was 17 when her mother died. She was as beautiful as an angel and had a spirit bright enough to light up the darkest holler. Her father called her his treasure, his perfect creation. But there was sin in how he treasured her. The boys grew jealous and resentful as they watched their father lavish attention on their sister while treating them like cursed mistakes. When Ara turned his end, 18, and started talking about leaving for the valley towns to find work, Ezekiel forbade it. He said she belonged with family and that God had made her to be the light of their house. That was 4 years ago, Reverend. 4 years since anyone in town has seen that poor girl. With this terrible knowledge and a determination that bureaucratic indifference could not stop, Thomas marched back to Sheriff Coleman's office with fire in his eyes and righteous anger in his voice. This time, he didn't ask for help. He demanded it. He said he would ride to the county seat and get federal marshals if the local law didn't act. Coleman finally gave in when he thought about the possibility of outside interference and a possible scandal. He gathered a group of 6 men who didn't want to go to the Whitmore farmhouse. The sheriff's party came closer through the darkening dusk of a cold October afternoon. The old building sat against the mountainside like a cancer, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Before they had even fully reined in their horses, Jebediah came out onto the sagging front porch. His pale eyes looked at the men with the cold, calculating look of a snake measuring potential threats. Silas's huge body filled the doorway behind him, and his twisted face was set in a mask of angry hostility. "Hey, Sheriff Coleman!" Jebediah said, his voice full of mild curiosity that no one else could miss. "What brings you so far from town on such an unpleasant evening?" Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly regretting his decision to give in to the preacher's demands, but he pressed on with the authority of his office. "We have a warrant to search these premises, Jebediah. There are questions that need answering about your sister's whereabouts." Jebediah's lips curled into a smile that was as cold as winter moonlight on fresh snow. "There's nothing here but our family's business, Sheriff. Nothing that has to do with the law or the good people of redemption." His tone was final, making the horses prance nervously, and the posse members look at each other nervously. But Sheriff Coleman had gone too far to back down now, without losing what little reputation he had left. The search of the Whitmore farmhouse started out with the careful planning of men who knew their reputations were on the line, but it quickly turned into the frantic search of a posse that found nothing where something terrible should have been. The main floor of the rundown building looked strangely clean, as if someone had scrubbed away all signs of normal human life. There were only a few plates, some dented pots and pans, and enough food for 2 people in the kitchen. Not 3. There were 2 narrow beds in the brothers' shared bedroom, arranged with military precision. There was also a 3rd room that might have belonged to a young woman. It was completely empty, with clean floorboards and walls that only had faded rectangles where pictures had once hung. Sheriff Coleman felt like the October sky that threatened snow before nightfall was pressing down on him. His men searched more and more desperately, turning over furniture and looking in every nook and cranny for proof that a woman had lived in this house not too long ago. Deputy Mills looked at the barn, and Deputy Harrison looked at the root cellar, but they both came back with nothing but cobwebs and the smell of mold. Reverend Thomas, the preacher, walked through the house with barely contained anger. His eyes kept going back to the locked basement door, which stood in the middle of the main room like an accusation. Thomas pointed with a shaking finger at the heavy wooden door and said, "I insist we look at what's on the other side." Jebediah's smile stayed the same, but something flickered behind his pale eyes, like candlelight in a drafty room. "I'm sorry, Reverend, but that's not possible. The key was lost years ago when our dear mother died." There's nothing down there but old root vegetables and the bones of winters past. It's not worth breaking down a perfectly good door for moldy turnips and mouse droppings." Silas nodded his agreement with the enthusiasm of a child repeating a well-rehearsed lesson. "Lost the key," he said, his huge hands playing with the brim of his hat. "There's nothing down there but old things and dead things." But Ara could hear every word of the conversation through the floorboards. Even though she was in a small circle of imprisonment, she knew this was her last chance. She had been working on more than just the mind games she played with her brothers for weeks. She had been getting ready for this moment with the focused intensity of a woman who knew that failure would mean a lifetime of horror. She had a piece of jagged metal hidden under the pile of rags that served as her bedding. She had found it in the basement's debris and worked it to a razor edge by scraping it against the stone foundation for hours. The small window near the ceiling of her prison had been boarded up on the outside, but age and weather had made some of the boards loose enough that thin streams of light could sometimes get through the darkness. More importantly, someone years ago stacked dry firewood against the basement's inner wall and tied it down with a hemp rope that had become brittle with age and moisture. Ara had found that if she pulled on her shortened chain as hard as it would go, she could barely touch the rope with the sharpened metal. She could hear Sheriff Coleman's voice getting more and more angry as he got ready to give up. "Boys, I don't see any evidence of wrongdoing here." Maybe the preacher was mistaken about what he saw. The words sounded like a man trying to convince himself as much as others, but they made Ara act like a woman who was drowning and needed help. She pushed the metal against the old rope and started to saw with all her might. The chain held her back, but 4 years of anger and hope made her move. The fibers of the rope came apart one by one, and with each small tear, she got closer to what could be her salvation, or just another cruel disappointment. The chain hurt her ankle with every move, and her pregnant belly made the work hard, but she kept going because she knew that this moment would change her life forever. The rope broke with a sound like a gunshot in the small space, and the carefully stacked firewood fell to the floor of the basement with a crash that could be heard all over the house. But Ara was already on the move, picking up the driest pieces she could find and putting them near the small window where the wind might blow in and feed the flames. She hit the stone wall with her metal piece over and over again, sending sparks into the dry wood. Finally, after a long time, a thin stream of smoke began to rise. The fire caught quickly, fueled by wood that had been drying out in the basement for years. The smoke that came through the cracks in the floorboards above carried the unmistakable smell of burning wood and the desperate hope of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Sheriff Coleman was already walking toward the door when the bad smell hit him. He looked up at the ceiling, where wisps of smoke were starting to curl through the cracks between the boards. "Fire," he said, and the word cut through the tension like a knife. "There's a fire in this house." The brothers changed right away, and it was bad. Jebediah's carefully kept calm broke like ice in the spring, and Silas let out a roar of panic and rage that shook the windows in their frames. They ran toward the basement door with such clear desperation that even the most doubtful member of the group could no longer doubt that something horrible was hiding down there. "Break it down." Sheriff Coleman yelled, and his deputies attacked the door with axes and crowbars while smoke continued to fill the air above them. The wood broke and fell apart surprisingly easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment to happen. What they found in the basement would stay with every man there for the rest of their lives. Ara huddled in the corner like a wild animal, her eyes wide and scared, her face thin from lack of food, and her belly swollen from horrors that no civilized person could understand. The chain on her ankle shone dully in the firelight, and the filthy conditions of her imprisonment showed that she had been systematically degraded and abused for years. There was a brief moment of silence after they found out, but then it turned into chaos. Some of the posse members threw up where they were standing, and others backed away in horror from what they saw. Silas made a desperate leap for the stairs, but 3 deputies tackled him and brought him down with clubs and sheer willpower. Jebediah, who was always calculating, just stood there and smiled his cold smile, while Sheriff Coleman arrested him with hands that shook with rage and disgust. When they finally brought Ara up from the basement and into the fading light of an October afternoon, she fell right away because her legs couldn't support her after being locked up for so long. The sunlight hurt her eyes, and the fresh mountain air filled her lungs like a drug after being in the stale air of her underground prison for so long. Reverend Thomas knelt next to her, tears streaming down his weathered face as he offered her his coat to cover her up. He spoke soft words of comfort that she could barely understand because she was so scared and relieved. The ride back to redemption was like a funeral procession of shocked silence. The whole community was about to face the darkness that had grown in their midst, while they chose to ignore the truth that made them uncomfortable. The Whitmore farmhouse was empty for the first time in 25 years. Smoke was still coming out of its basement windows, like incense offered to the dark gods who had ruled over the horrors that had happened inside its walls. The trial of Jebediah and Silas Whitmore started on the first Monday of December 1883. From the time the courthouse doors opened, it was clear that this trial would be different from anything the mountain community of Redemption had ever seen. The courtroom was full of people who were horrified and curious at the same time. Their faces showed that they were uncomfortable because they had to face the darkness that had grown in their midst while they chose to ignore the truth instead of facing it. Judge Bartholomew Hayes, a stern man with silver whiskers who had been in charge of frontier justice for 32 years, looked out over the packed gallery and knew that this case would test not only the defendants but also the very soul of the community. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Ara had found refuge in the small home of Reverend Thomas and his wife Martha. Martha was a strong woman who had learned to be strong by caring for the wounded souls that mountain life brought her on a regular basis. Martha Thomas had the rare ability to comfort people without needing to know why. With her patient care, Ara began to heal from wounds that were much deeper than the scars on her ankles where the chains had bitten into her flesh. The physical recovery was the easier part. With the right food, warm baths, and clean clothes, her cheeks and limbs got their color and strength back very quickly. The psychological healing was much more complicated. It was like going through trauma in a maze with no clear path or certain endpoint. During those quiet weeks in the Thomas household, the main issue was whether or not the child inside her would grow. Every morning, Ara would sit by the kitchen window with her hands on her growing belly, trying to make a choice that would change not only her own life, but also the life of the innocent child she was carrying. The baby was due in early spring, and every day that passed made her feel more strongly how ironic it was that something so pure could come from something so corrupt. Martha never pushed Ara for answers, but sometimes Ara would see the older woman looking at her with eyes full of understanding and compassion. Ara knew that whatever choice she made would be supported without judgment or reservation. On the third day of the trial, when the prosecution called Ara to testify, the courtroom was so quiet that the winter wind rattling the windows sounded like thunder. She had been awake all night, staring at the ceiling while Martha held her hand. Both women knew that the testimony would make her relive every horrible thing that happened to her while she was in captivity in the cold clinical language of the law. But when the time came, Ara stood up from her seat with a calmness that surprised even her. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible under the simple blue dress that Martha had sewn with love. Cornelius Blackwood, the defense attorney, had come all the way from Little Rock to work on this case. He was a loud man who had spent 2 days building a complicated story of victimhood that made the brothers look like tragic figures who had been twisted by their father's cruelty and society's rejection. He spoke clearly about their physical deformities, their lack of normal human contact, and the mental harm caused by years of being made fun of and left out. Blackwood said with dramatic passion, "These men are not monsters. They are the broken products of a broken system." Driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond their control, he had even brought in a doctor from St. Louis to testify about the supposed link between physical deformity and mental instability. This was all part of his plan to turn the brothers from criminals into victims who deserved pity instead of punishment. But when Ara got on the stand and started to talk in her clear, steady voice, all of Blackwood's carefully thought-out points fell apart like sandcastles in the tide. She didn't speak with the raw emotion that the audience expected, and she didn't try to get their sympathy by showing how much pain she was in. She spoke instead with the calm authority of someone who had seen pure evil and come out of it with her humanity intact. She talked about her time in captivity with clinical accuracy, describing how her brothers abused her in a planned way, how they tried to break her spirit, and the sick religious reasons they used to justify their actions. Her voice rang out in the crowded courtroom. They told themselves they were making something pure. They believed that their suffering justified what they did, that my pain was payment for their father's sins. But I learned something in that basement that they never understood. True strength does not come from hurting others. It comes from enduring suffering without losing your ability to hope, to show mercy, and to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Her testimony had an immediate and profound effect. A lot of women in the gallery cried, and men who had first shown sympathy for the brother's situation couldn't look her in the eye. Even Jebediah, who had stayed calm and collected during the whole thing, seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. His pale eyes flickered with what might have been shame. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a decision and found the defendant guilty on all counts. Judge Hayes sent both brothers to life in prison with hard labor in the state prison in Little Rock. The gallery murmured in approval, but there was no sense of triumph. Justice had been done, but everyone there knew that no verdict could make up for the years of pain or bring back what had been lost in that basement prison. As winter turned into the tentative promise of spring, Ara made her decision about the child with the same quiet strength she had shown on the witness stand. She looked at her son's perfect face on a warm April morning and saw not the legacy of her tormentors, but the promise of a future free of their hatred. She named him Hope, which made some people in the community raise their eyebrows, but it was the perfect name for her determination to make something beautiful out of the ashes of her suffering. On a sunny afternoon in late May, Ara stood on the porch of the small cottage that the community had helped her build on the edge of redemption. Her baby son was sleeping peacefully in her arms as she looked out over the rolling Ozark Hills. The mountains that had once been her prison now spread out in front of her like a promise of endless possibilities. The green slopes caught the sunlight and held it like a blessing. She was no longer the broken girl who had been chained up in a basement, and her story didn't end with her rescue. She was a survivor, a mother, and a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out stronger, not weaker, in her ability to love. The scars on her ankles had faded to thin silver lines, which were barely visible reminders of chains that would never hold her again. Hope stirred in her arms and opened his eyes. They were clear, with no sign of the darkness he had come from, only the endless possibilities of a new beginning. The future was uncertain, but not scary for either of them. They both knew that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could find a way to shine.